Hey everybody, welcome again to Media Ethics, second week. Um, I hope you enjoyed the first chapter of the book. And right now we're kind of basically in the point of very early stages where we're just basically defining ethics. And remember that we have discussion points that are essentially as your homework for each of these weeks and the reading, of course, leading up to the midterm exam in March. So so right now I'm recording this over the weekend. So far, 7 people have actually done the discussion point. Remember, you got to do that if you want to score high on class participation because that's all we got for asynchronous. But um, anyway, so right now we're kind of at the point where basically we're just, like I said, defining media ethics. Chapter 1 was also due. Next week, chapter 2 will be due, and that's when we'll discuss like how philosophers feel about media ethics, that sort of thing. Let's for now just really concentrate on like some of your responses um, to the to my discussion point, and that is essentially defining media ethics. I'll tell you one thing about it is that there's no wrong answer to this because it's really, and I think most of you basically hit this right on the nail. It's really like how your society, your group, your culture, your specific surroundings and everything define it. Okay. Now, I mean, that could be taken in a very perverse way because there's some groups that just don't really understand maybe the difference between right and wrong. But how do you, but and you could argue that there's just some things are just clearly wrong and some things are clearly right, no matter what the group, like murder, for instance, that sort of thing. But you but basically the broad definition is essentially like what how media is, or sorry, media or ethics essentially is however you define it. Now, one thing to keep in mind in this class is that, and I've seen this in exams and everything, is that sometimes when I ask questions about ethics and everything, people or me, I want it to be really about media ethics. People will stray into ethics in general. We're just concentrating on media ethics, ethics of media, the morality and ethical standards of media. Okay. Um, so if we go to the discussion points right here, um, okay, so let's just like really look at the. I probably should have had this ready already. Remember also we have like the module also helps provide a guide for what we're going to be discussing each week in the asynchronous tapes. Okay, so how do you define ethics? What does it mean? Who determines what's ethical or not? So we have Alex Betty here. Hope I pronounced that right. I define ethics as moral principles that determine societal behaviors. That's pretty much what it is. It's almost like the way to define ethics. It's really one of the hardest questions because it's almost like defining with its own definition. It's almost like you have to define it with a name, which is actually a rule of thumb that you shouldn't do when you define something. But it's hard to define without actually using the word itself. These behaviors include an example of a person treating others with kindness, compassion, and respect. This example would also include people refraining from criminal activity such as stealing, murder, and assault. What's interesting about this is where maybe can kind of delineate depending on your societal standards, for instance. And again, I mean, in this class, there's really nobody who's ever wrong. What I grade for and what I look for is just to make sure that you're kind of backing up. And I mean, in the discussion points, I'm not really looking for that so much, but in the exam questions and things like that, I just want to make sure that you have an opinion, but you basically are able to back it up with facts or examples. Okay. So the one way I maybe would argue this is, again, it's all determined by wherever the society is, and there's many people who consider abortion murder. Yet, in many states, of the United States, things have changed. It's not considered that way. In other places, it is. Another one is actually capital punishment is also considered murder by many people, and many by not. So sometimes these things can be delineate depending on whatever society, culture, or group you're in. Some people may even argue. I mean, I'm finally getting around to watching Mad Men, and I mean, there's a lot of lack of morality in that show. But they would probably argue some of these people within this culture of the advertising world that you have to be ruthless, you have to be tough to basically, to get ahead. So there's basically ways that like that can actually delineate itself slightly, maybe not too far, but um again, I would define, Hannah, thank you. I would define ethics as a set of values and beliefs that serve as the basis upon one makes decisions. Well, that's true. This means that each person holds concepts, ideas. That's one of the things I'm going to be talking a lot about in this class is that there's like, and I'm going to be talking about things in my next lecture about the Potter's box. And one of the things you're guided by is not necessarily just like the moral and ethical standards as set by ancient philosophers or been dead a long time, but essentially what you've been raised with, your gut, whatever you're like, you've been taught with, your parents would teach you with. I mean, and again, how do you define it when you have parents who teach you some things that the society would just consider totally wrong? I remember reading about like some family that actually named their kids after Hitler's henchmen. I mean, crap like that. So anyway, there's things like that come up that raise questions. And then we also but then there's also, I mean, maybe not as far as extreme as Nazism, but obviously, but there's things that we see on TV that are totally hideous and exploitative and that sort of thing. And one thing you're going to see like a continual argument in this class is how do you balance that, again, as I talked last week, against like the whole idea of like trying to make a living and making money and that sort of thing. And I think I talked about this in my last lecture, but I always had a problem with the Jersey Shore television show, and because I felt like I grew up there and I didn't act like that and that sort of thing. But you can't really necessarily blame MTV for doing what they were doing, because it was because the fact is that there is actually the people who do act like that, behave like that, and at the same time, it's a business that's trying to make money. Maybe it's shining a spotlight on one aspect of it. Maybe you get maybe quibble with like the fact that the show is titled Jersey Shore, and that makes it all encompassing. Like everybody in the Jersey Shore behaves that way. And as you can see, do I look like Snooki? No. All right. So thanks to Emily and everybody else, Victoria. Um, you know, Morality comes into play. Right, what it was between right and wrong. That sort of thing. Um, so anyway, so that becomes like a big issue right there. Okay. All right. Okay, so the first chapter really kind of deals with that in a very cursory way. And what it does is, what I like to do is actually, again, probably the best way to define something, really try to explain something and to talk about something, discuss something, and address something when it comes to ethics and everything, is really to provide examples. And one thing you should know is that, like, and this is very important actually, when I actually like point to something in a certain chapter or something like that, or you'll see like a yellow highlight or something. I think I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again. You very much want to keep that in mind, maybe make a note of it, because it's probably something I might actually have on the exam. So the first chapter actually like kind of explores the territory of like, how, when you define ethics and that sort of thing in journalism or in media. And again, we're talking about media here. We're not talking about just about newspapers. We're not talking about like TV. We're talking about like maybe TV shows, that sort of thing. It's all the kind of how society like essentially defines it. Okay. I like to think that there's like a lot of people who kind of come into play for that decision. Again, and I'm not going to necessarily define ethics and that sort of thing for you, but I'm going to provide the tools for you, try to help to make the decisions on what you think may be ethical or not, okay, in the media. All right, so let me go back to sharing the screen here. All right, so I have a very slow computer here. All right, so whenever it comes into play, and then again, what you ought to keep in mind is actually that again, that you're playing an editor role here, not playing a reporter role. So you have to kind of like switch your brains from like what you did in writing for media and everything, and make decisions of what goes out there into the public. Okay. All right. So I like to think, so you have like essentially the journalists who are involved whenever there's decisions made of what goes into the media. You have the journalists obviously are involved in making the decisions. Okay. But they are also influenced by other people. There's the politicians who kind of help make those decisions because they will influence the journalists and help convince them to do whatever they do. You have the business world that plays a role, okay? You have like the science world that plays a role, especially like the days of COVID and everything, which we're still dealing with, obviously. That kind of plays a role. And one of the best ways to actually achieve some sort of ethical goal is to try to get like all of these different people on board. And you may not like get everybody or as many as possible on board. Environmentalists, you could really go on here, activists. Get them on board so you basically get to, again, what I've said before is the closest version of the truth. Sorry about that. Or closest to the truth as possible. Because you can't always be in that room when you make the decisions or when you find information that's important and you need to get out to the public, okay? And what's interesting about that is that, again, like I said, you try to get as many people on board as possible, but you can't always get everybody on board, all right? And there's very much in defining and coming up with an ethical standard for whatever you're going to produce in the media. There is almost like a lot of times, I would say, an ends justify the means kind of a process to keep in mind, especially when you're dealing with like broadcast journalism, newspaper journalism, news site journalism, digital journalism, that sort of thing. And actually, that's what they actually talk about essentially in the first chapter. And I go off of my Amazon Kindle here. Journalists as watchdogs. Journalists have been talking about their watchdog role since the early days of the American Republic. Another popular phrase used to define the role of journalists is relatively new. The public's right to know became a mantra of journalists after World War II, but especially essentially during the Watergate scandal, when actually that was like the big sexy thing when journalists actually found things about the President Nixon's administration that were not good or not great and illegal, and people went to jail, and he ended up resigning, that sort of thing. But a lot of times, you don't always have that kind of ethical play handed to you on a silver platter. You have to dig for it. You have to do as much research as possible, and you have to listen to people because you have to get to that closest version of the truth, as close to the truth as possible. Okay. And they actually bring up an interesting example here where sometimes things on their face may not have come across as ethical or completely moral, but the most important thing is to really kind of keep an open mind. And this is the kind of stuff I should say we're going to get into deeper when we actually talk about how philosophers have developed their own ethical standards or something. But that is really important to listen and learn when you go out there and you do things that are actually produced for the media, in the media, okay? So what they talk about this here is in Houston, this is an interesting thing because a lot of times what journalists have to do is they have to get tips from people. And a lot of times those tips come in anonymously or they come in off the record or something. And I'm bringing this up as an example where maybe a morality or ethics can be is not so easily defined, and it's not so easily exercised, and it's not so easily executed, the end result, okay? It could be done in a backdoor way, okay? So sometimes you get information in a way, maybe you think it's a little tawdry or it's not exactly completely ethical and that sort of thing. And what happened with a lot of people were arguing with this situation back 20 years ago was this KHAU Houston television station was getting information about people who are having these Firestone tires that essentially were being blown out and that sort of thing. Now, the ethical argument that could be made here was that they decided to go ahead with this story essentially, even though there was only maybe a few people talking about it. And again, it goes culture by culture. There's some news organizations that probably rejected this, and I think they even said that because they felt like maybe there wasn't enough sources, maybe they didn't feel like these people were credible, that sort of thing. But this station decided to go ahead with it. They said Warner then reported a story about a 14-year-old cheerleader who was riding in a foreign sport. Actually, I'm sorry, I should go back to the start of it. In the Houston television station KHEU opened its 10 o'clock program with a report by its Defenders investigative team. Sometimes when you see his Defenders investigative team on TV, you kind of think, oh my God. And sometimes they sensationalize and that sort of thing. So you have to also deal with, like, the public is also, the general reading public is also probably also part of that list of getting on board, the readers, the viewers getting on board and trying to determine what's ethical or not. And sometimes I have to admit, when I see some of this stuff on broadcast TV, I think to myself, oh my God, what is this about now? Okay. So it says, it began her statement like this: it was a new marriage for Cynthia and CJ Jackson. We were just two middle-aged couples trying to find and have fun. So one June day, the choir teacher and husband packed up her Ford Explorer. They went for a ride. They took off for Galveston. They heard a pop. It was the back tire. The other husband, hey baby, wake up. The truck is shaking. The truck began to roll. Next thing they remember was waking up in the hospital. Both of her legs were amputated. So they started with one person. Now, again, you look at that and you say, like, and that's like a big issue, actually, is also a morality decisions like these news organizations make. Is it a single source story? Is it that one thing that just, so what they have now, so I showed you that list of all the people you want to try to get involved in a story. Now, but what they had here essentially was not maybe even like close to that. Okay. So sometimes you have to kind of make decisions based on your own instincts, your own gut feeling, and then you try to work from there. Okay. So they basically, what they had essentially was just maybe like the general public and the journalists, but they didn't have the business world, which would be the Ford people who, I guess, owned Firestone Tires at one time. They didn't have the people who make the tires, which would be the scientists, I guess. They didn't have the politicians who could make legislation that could kind of safeguard against this. They had to make decisions based on what they had at the moment. So Warner then reported a story about a 14-year-old cheerleader who was riding a Ford Explorer. So now they have actually another person. One of the Explorer's Firestone tires came apart at a highway speed. The vehicle flipped 3 times, killing the girl. Okay. This was a 10-minute report. So what do you do? I mean, like, so sometimes you can't get all those people on the list. You try to get there. You try to get to that, all the people on the list, because that helps you get to the most obtainable version of the truth, but you can't always get there. Okay, they contacted Ford, and Ford asked them to give their side of the story. So they did actually get them involved. And then they tried to blame it on driver error. Okay. Immediately after Warner's report was broadcast. So this is actually where, like, maybe you come into a situation where you can't get all those people, but you do it based on your own gut instinct. I mean, you trust people, you look in their eyes, you say, okay, is this something that actually, I mean, it happened more than once, so that's important. So you gotta go by these certain standards and see if there's like certain layers of trust that you can build in and go ahead with this story. And then there's also like an ends justify the means thing, because immediately after Warner's report was broadcast, viewers flooded the station with reports of other accidents involving Explorers with Firestone tires. Warner began to put together a follow-up story. Then Firestone officials learned she was doing another report. They fired off a letter to the executive owners of the station. So they continue with their falsehoods and all this other stuff. So what happened was it's almost like it puts everything in reverse. It's like you go with your gut instincts, you feel like what your set of morality is, and what your group is, and what other people feel. And in this particular case, this particular news station, they group as a culture and how they define ethics, decided to go forward with this, and their decision turned out to be, I would say, ethically right from my point of view, based on their own ethics, because what it did was it actually exposed a huge problem. And by putting that report out there, it got people out there to talk about it. Okay. So that's how, so in that particular case, that group defining ethics worked. Okay. Months after the KHU's first report, so then you got the politicians getting involved. So you have the business, everybody else, and then it became like they got a big award out of it. And then it actually even went up to like, I said the above 3 reports, there's other stuff mentioned too. Examples of well-told news stories. Everyone would agree they are first-rate journalism. We would take that a step further and exemplify ethical journalism. But like I said, it doesn't always necessarily start out that way. What you have to do is you have to like almost go by your gut instinct. And what I'll be talking about eventually is maybe like whatever ethical principles that have been determined by society, but also, like I said, whatever ethics are defined by whatever particular culture you live in. And if you work for a place like KHAU that maybe has like apparently good gut instincts, good ethical principles, good, self-regulation, and a good sense of judging people, then you come out with a good and ethical moral result. Okay. And let me just show you like what this turned into 20 years ago, just from like what was just essentially like a report that started with essentially like just a couple people.
When the Ford Motor Company announced 2 weeks ago that it would be replacing 13 million Firestone tires on its most popular sport utility vehicles and trucks amid concerns about tire safety, Firestone turned around and asked federal regulators to investigate Ford, claiming a design flaw in the Ford Explorer, not the tires.
So they admitted it. And I was even trying to find this too. They even went on TV and apologized for this. How about that? So so that was actually like interesting in itself. Again, you start off with this kind of small nugget, and then it just goes on and on and on. So anyway. I'm sorry. Anyway, so let's hear more.
Made the SUV unsafe to drive. While both companies point fingers at one another, what is not in dispute is that since last year, the failures of Firestone tires on Ford Explorers have been linked to at least 174 deaths and 700 injuries in the United States alone. The question is, could it have been prevented? As we first reported last October, the answer may lie in Venezuela, which, with 47 fatalities and 200 injuries, has the highest death rate in the world from accidents in Ford Explorers equipped with Firestone tires. We went to Venezuela and found that both companies knew that they had a problem, but they kept it to themselves until it became an international crisis. Here in this one junkyard outside Caracas, we found 7 Ford Explorers that had been involved in major accidents. All of them were equipped with Firestone tires. In all of the accidents, the stories were similar. The driver hears a sudden loud pop at one of the tires and starts to lose control of the Explorer as it slides across the highway, eventually rolling over several times, causing death or injury to the people inside. That is exactly what happened to Antonio and Mira David, their 3 children, as they were driving along a highway 7 months ago in their Ford Explorer.
Had an explosion, seconds, the Explorer started to roll over. My 3 kids, I found them out of the Explorer.
The David's oldest child, Sumaya, suffered minor injuries. Their 9-year-old daughter, Jessica, died instantly. And their 4-year-old son, Antonio Jose, was rushed to the hospital where he too died.
I arrived at the hospital and they told me what had happened. I said, an accident. They said, what kind of car were you driving? That's the first question they asked me. Sort of Explorer, Ford Explorer. I said, oh my God, you could not imagine how many accidents had happened with these cars. Why couldn't we hear about that before?
The fact is, they could have heard about it before. Firestone and Ford knew they had a serious problem on their hands. According to an undated and unsigned Ford memo submitted by them to a congressional committee, the company acknowledged that it was aware in July of '97 that Explorers in Venezuela would turn over unexpectedly as a consequence of a tire explosion. And in 1999, knowing that they had a problem in Venezuela, Firestone and Ford conducted a joint review and found that accidents in Ford Explorers with Firestone tires caused 15 fatalities and 35 injuries, and that the root cause was determined.
And that was before the KHOU report. How about that?
To be tread separation of the tires.
Right.
What is tire tread separation and how does it happen?
This problem starts at the belt edges, and these sharp wires at the belt edge
See if we can get the
chew
exact.
away at the rubber.
Richard Baumgartner is a retired. That is Samuel Rue Rios, head of Venezuela's Consumer Protection Agency,
There's
which
the
is seeking
politicians.
charges of reckless homicide against executives of Ford and Firestone.
They knew long ago what was causing the accidents, and they failed to notify consumers or users. At least 80 to 90% of the accidents could have been prevented.
That's a strong accusation. I mean, you're saying they knew about it and could have prevented it.
They can't deny it. They can't deny it. They knew their vehicles were rolling over, and this was causing death.
What does Bridgestone Firestone have to say about that? We talked to Jorge Gonzalez, who runs Firestone in Venezuela. The Venezuelan government is seeking criminal charges against you personally, as well as other officials at Ford and at Firestone. They say that you committed reckless homicide. How do you respond to that?
No, we don't. We do not believe this is the case. We act always in a responsible manner.
Well, they're saying you didn't. They're saying that you knew that you had a problem and that you didn't address it in a timely manner.
Once all the facts are known, I think we will prevail.
What is most troubling to Venezuelan government investigators is that once Firestone and Ford became aware of the problem, rather than ordering a costly recall, they decided to add what is called a nylon cap ply, a fifth layer of added protection in new tires, intended to prevent tread separation and other hazards. But even that wasn't accomplished. When investigators examined these tires taken from Firestone's Venezuelan plant, they found that the new nylon cap was not added. What's more, they say Firestone intentionally stamped a label on the tires indicating that.
What happened was there was a mistake that was never caught, and in no way, shape, or form did this stamping error compromise either the integrity nor the quality of the tire.
But how could the mistake be insignificant if Firestone and Ford agreed that the nylon cap would make that tire safer? Doesn't that indicate that by making this change, you're trying to solve a problem?
By making this change, we were trying to improve our product, which is a continuous ongoing project within our company. We always try to give the best, the safest tire possible.
You have quality control in Firestone. So how can you have quality control and you stamp these tires as having this nylon safety cap when in fact they don't?
Okay, because this is one of the issues that is regrettable.
It's Firestone's position that the nylon cap is used only to allow drivers to go.
Oh, getting a lot of gobbledygook there. But anyway, so that's they eventually had to, like I said, actually I was trying to find a tape where actually came out and apologized. So you know, so that became a big deal. So that's again, like you try to get the closest attainable version of the truth as possible. But sometimes, like when you try to bring in everybody into the store, it's like different walks of life and that sort of thing. And you can't always do that until maybe the end of the story. But as long as your particular culture is trustworthy enough to like actually make a determination that you feel is ethical, that's great. If you feel like they make decisions that are not ethical, then maybe you shouldn't be part of it. Okay. It says here they undoubtedly improved the safety of thousands of motorists. It challenged the federal government and then apparently in Venezuela also to, you know, make changes. Okay. Here's some of the things that actually like, and then when I talk about exam, maybe this might appear there, but you know, again, like, I mean, it really like ethics and morality and that sort of thing is determined by, you know, again, like whatever cultural or societal set you're in, as you guys mentioned on the discussion point. But there are some things that you can use as maybe a guideline, you know, that are mentioned in this book, you know, to help determine in the media world how to get to that ethical place. And it says, just as lawyers, doctors, priests have special responsibility, journalists too have obligations. Now, again, these are probably essentially like a guideline that's essentially set by other journalists and that sort of thing. So, you know, so it is actually a societal determination here. But although some may quibble with this list, most American journalists would agree that they share these goals: to inform the public about incidents, trends, and developments in society and government. Journalists are obliged to gather information as best they can and tell the truth as they find it. Okay, so it's important to dig up and get as much information as possible. And sometimes, as I just showed you, you can't always get it by just, asking questions. You actually have to put maybe even the story out there, put whatever you got out there, and then it suddenly opens the door to other stories, other related stories, other information that's important. Okay. Unhampered by conflicting interests, that sort of thing, conflicts of interest, not getting in the way of things like people, like maybe having relationships with people like on the job and that sort of thing that could actually compromise what you're doing. Speaking of madmen, to treat people, both those in the audience and those who are making the news, with fairness, respect, and compassion. So you do go to back to that list that I was talking about of all the people you should try to like insult when you like see different stories like this. I mean, sometimes you do have to like run into certain things like confrontations and things like that, and there's not much you can do about that. But one thing you want to do is you definitely want to like earn respect, because by getting respect and everything, you have other people respect, because then people, even if they disagree with you, it gives you a certain amount of credibility. And again, it's stuff that's determined by society, but it's something that where they feel like maybe they even have to answer you. Like 60 Minutes is considered a very trustworthy place. So whenever they come up with something controversial, that sort of thing, it's actually, people feel like they have to address them. And a lot of times when they don't actually respond to them, they actually look even worse. So it does journalists a little good to strive for the truth if a large number of people do not believe news reports because they do not trust or respect the news media. Well, that's been a big issue in recent years, because we've heard of the talk from like Trump and all those people really about fake news and that sort of thing. So that's kind of, and then we've also had the issues with like Facebook and news coming off of that, and how that isn't like always completely trustworthy or whatever. So, it's all about like, again, how your society, how your group, how your culture and everything determines what's legitimate, what's not, what's moral, what's not, what's ethics, what's not. And I would say the society in general has basically said that you shouldn't really trust what you read off of Facebook as your news. You probably have even though Elon Musk has taken over, you probably have a better shot at Twitter, because at least you could get like your news quicker, and you have a lot more, I feel like, credible news sources actually go on there and post their news. To nurture the democratic process, for people to govern themselves, they must be informed about the issues and the actions of their government. The news media are the chief providers of that information. So, obviously it matters being a watchdog. You're a watchdog, you're an informer. And by being an informer, you're educating people and you're getting them to know things. I mean, this is kind of the kind of stuff that like, basically, has been a media thing for a very long time. It's just that in recent years, we've had the situation with the internet where things have kind of, diffused so much that you don't really know who you're trusting anymore. And of course, another big issue is like, back in the day, you had like one program like 60 Minutes that would serve as like a news magazine. You had like essentially like only a few networks or something, but now you have so many different places where you can get information. Like this was from 20 years ago, when a lot of the internet was actually driven by a dial-up service that was actually hard to get to. It was actually hard to get the news on the internet. So people would trust 60 Minutes a lot more than they did, or I should say rely on it a lot more. But now there's actually so many other places people can turn to. So you have to go to society, probably still at this day, still even with all these other sources out there, consider 60 Minutes a trusty source. But what you have for the war is prevent maybe these other people, if you can, from going to those other places that are not ethical or moral, whatever. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I meant to show you this too. I come to apologize. So they eventually did apologize to Congress. This I didn't find the video, but I found this. As Chief Executive Officer, I come to apologize to you, the American people, especially the families who have lost loved ones in these terrible rollover accidents. I also come to accept full and personal responsibility on behalf of Bridgestone Firestone, the events that led to the hearings. Okay. So that's so again, like, ultimately what led to this story was getting all those groups on board, getting them all involved, getting them all like, and again, just trying to use your gut, whatever ethical principles you have, basically, that you might follow, or a guideline is to kind of lead you through the process and get to a point that actually ended up in a good place, ended up benefiting and bettering people's lives, okay? All right. So that's like pretty much a lot with the first, it talks about like improving the profession. I mean, again, with that, I mean, it's just a matter of just really just kind of like, again, like you're using your societal instincts, using your societal guidelines and everything to help kind of shape what you think should come out there as a media production. Okay. Okay. So let's go to like what's next. I actually am going, again, this is the weekend, so I actually haven't posted this yet. But you do have another discussion point that I'm going to be posting, and it's actually kind of related. I feel like this is actually kind of an important, what happened to it? Where'd it go? I have it tucked under here in modules. Again, this is my teacher reading. You'll see it though, but basically, discussion points. Here is the next discussion point. As the media's coverage of the Biden administration, but oh boy, I did not. Biden administration ethical. I think that's an important point because I think that's something that kind of comes up a lot. It's not necessarily like identical necessarily to the Firestone scandal or something like that, but like what really is a scandal? I mean, it's really like something that's kind of determined by society, and I feel like I get kind of bothered when I see like what they call this kind of like false equivalence that goes on. And I'm not necessarily taking political sides here, but I feel like the media like spends a lot of time, in the pursuit of being fair and balanced, which is like something else that's actually comes into play when you try to determine what's ethical and what's not. Okay, because there's actually like a number of things that actually like, that come into play when people determine what's ethical, and that one of them is objectivity. Objectivity is actually something that basically means that you're impartial, that you're not involved directly, as I mentioned, conflict of interest. You want to strive for that. But nobody is ever completely totally objective, because I mean there's a lot of people who are essentially like, I mean, none of us are robots or anything like that. So anyway, you want to be balanced. You want to like try to present two sides, three sides I mentioned before, not relying so much on single sources, that sort of thing. But that can go a little too far. And there's this whole kind of trend in the media critic world about what they consider both sides journalism. I mean, when you have a situation where like, like the January 6th insurrection, I'm sorry, I don't care what side of you're on, people died from that and everything. I mean, to me, like the society, based on what society's beliefs and rules and guidelines are, there's no two sides to that. It's actually just really just one side that's right, one side that's wrong. But again, that's just a side of determination. I know other people feel differently. Okay. But this whole idea of trying to get both sides, and I feel like that's almost kind of happening here with this whole situation with Biden and his classified documents, because Trump for a long time like took a really long time to like even give those documents back when they found it at his place in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. And he even like essentially obstructed the law and that sort of thing in the whole process. Well, Biden, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't right either, but at the same time, I mean, it seemed like kind of more like a clumsy thing, that sort of thing. And he actually reported it to the FBI. You could quibble about the fact that he didn't go to back to the public right away or whatever, but certainly, but balance is something that's actually something that you do take into consideration when you try to reach some sort of like ethical determination. And obviously like trying to seek the most obtainable version of the truth as possible. But that's something to consider when you go into this whole point here. And basically, the whole Firestone issue was like obviously was important to get both sides, because he just didn't want to like trust like the people's point of view on it. You had to get like more, first of all, you had to get more than one person to talk about it. So right there, you're getting kind of more of a both. I like to say, I don't like to say both sides. I like to say multi-perspective to try to lend credibility and layers to the argument. But at the same time, you also want to get the other side too. So you want to get like Firestone Ford, that sort of thing. Okay. But this, I mean, like, is it ethical? Is it, especially when it's compared to the Trump, what he did with classified documents, the media, are they making too much of it? That's something to think about. Is there two sides to this? I mean, Biden, I mean, a lot of people don't like him. and there's a lot of people who like him. Right now, it seems like more people don't like him than not. So, I mean, my kids will say, well, I guess we agree with his policies, but he's too old or whatever they'll say. And they feel like, he probably shouldn't run again, this sort of thing. I mean, is that part of it? Is that, maybe it's not as bad as the Trump situation, but, it's still not good what he did. Specifically with the revelations of classified documents that have been found. That's just not a full sentence. Sorry. Is the media making too much of this? Is the media not making enough of it? Okay. So there you have it. Okay. So that's the discussion point that'll be posted by Monday. Remember that I'm going to be posting all my lectures on Monday. Okay. All right, everybody. So that's it. That's this week's lecture. And then again, keep in mind for the exam, midway through the discussion point, et cetera, class participation, and that's it. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And if you haven't already, by the way, please send me an email. Not everybody has yet. Send me an email basically letting me know who you are, say hello. So I have your email so I can like correspond with you, send stuff back to you. And I need the grade or whatever. All right. Thanks very much. And I'll be talking to you.